Page 146. Their fight for the spreading of the truth is just as harsh and bitter as their words which they announce. They still only make an appearance as individuals and sacrifice everything for their duty and task. Their fight against the storm surge of the irrationality and untruth is, however, hopeless if they are not surrounded by helpful disciples who also do justice to their tasks and duties. These disciples, however, must first take in the teaching of the truth in order to be able to fulfill their duties and tasks. Therefore they should listen to the wise ones of the present time and open their senses to them. Even if these wise ones are, at the present time, only 3 in number, they are thus still the fundamental pioneers of the new time and the true proclaimers of the creational truth. Note: the third, Miriam Petra, has, together with the second, Anatole, died in an accident in 1981 in Germany, a car accident. Their knowledge and their wisdom exceed everything that has been brought to the earthly humankind in the bygone last 2,000 years. But they are still alone and need the help of numerous disciples who, however, must first recognize and utilize the presented teaching in a truth-grounding manner. Unfortunately, however, it is precisely there that factors of the human unintellect and the irrationality come to play, because many who hear the truth try to fathom the truth with material intellectual forms of thinking, and thus inevitably come across contradictions. This is because the material intellectual form of thinking is flawed and purely human, and is not able to grasp the ways of the spiritual intellectual thinking. This can only thereby be eliminated if the disciples grasp and take in the teaching of the truth proclaimers without searching for the causes of the truth, which are incomprehensible to them anyway. Thus, in the course of the time, they obtain enormous spiritual knowledge. Note: knowledge of the spiritual concerns, with the resulting capability to solve the questions that then appear by the wisdom of their own consciousness. If they, however, search in their unintellect, which is still inherent in them, for reasons and causes of the truth, then they go into the confusion through their material intellectual thinking, and thoroughly miss their determination. Namely, if a task is intended to be solved, then the necessary knowledge and abilities must first be created for the processing and working out of the solution. This is an unavoidable law. There are still only 3, parentheses, see sentence 569, truth proclaimers and prophets who proclaim the teaching of the Spirit in the present time for the future of the earth humankind. One of these forms is still young and will only appear in a few decades. The first form, however, has already embraced its task and throws the first waves of the change into your world. It serves to us as the receiver of this message, sought out from amongst the 1,000 millions of you humankind, your humankind. And truly this prophet is the greatest of the present time, for he will also be the mightiest amongst those who are yet to follow him. He lays the most important foundation stones of the spiritual teaching, again in a new form, and his name will never again perish. We know his inner natural forms, his loneliness and bitterness towards the irrationality and untruth, as it is characteristic of all truth proclaimers. They live in the following of the creational recommendations and laws, in mildness and goodness, and in merciless hardness. Note: hardness in the sense of being strict, disciplined, unrelenting, unyielding, and inexorable in the adherence and explanations of the truth, etc., when necessary, because this is required by the brazen regulation. Their senses are full of hopes that the earth human beings will become mighty in the rationality and in the intellect, and will not remain closed to the truth, because this must be so according to creational laws and recommendations. If they are, despite their embraced universal love, hard and often bring bitterness, then this occurs in application of the creational laws and recommendations. These are in their application just as inexorable as the spiritual laws in their effect. How much self-hardness and discipline, etc., are imposed on a true truth proclaimer cannot be by the earth human beings, because this question cannot be answered to them in their unintellect. The self-discipline and self-hardness, along with innumerable other factors, are, however, so great that the human being would call it phenomenal because it goes beyond their intellect. In equal measure, however, within the truth proclaimers of true form, the embraced universal love and the equality of the life forms are also characterized, which in their application likewise extend beyond the earthly human intellect. For how are the human beings able to understand the effects of the truth if they do not even recognize the truth themselves? The new way to be pursued is very difficult for the earth human beings, especially for the human beings of the white race who have been downtrodden by the fervor of civilization. But according to the inexorable laws and recommendations of the creation, every life form must reap what it has sown for itself. Therefore, whoever sows irrational teachings and passing things will reap irrational consequences, irrational conclusions and dust, but whoever sows the unpassing eternal truth will reap wisdom, and take calm steps through all upcoming confusions of the times, and will consistently prevail. The true knowledge of the truth gives him or her the certainty that everything eternal will outlive anything temporal in endless duration. When the eternal values of the creational truth are anchored in the human being, the eternal active powers of creational origin must therefore also be present in his or her spirit and endlessly outlast everything temporal. The death is no longer changed into a farce by angst-inducing irrational teachings, but rather into the factor of repose and further development. Thus for the human being the truth becomes true in the knowledge that he or she is immortal in the spirit. This uncontrovertible truth, however, also proves to him or her, if they acknowledge the creation as such in its power and truth, they will know of the activity of the creation within him or herself, from which he or she is able to draw only one inexorable conclusion, namely, that the spirit lives in him or her as a part piece and part power of the creation, which is synonymous to the human being as the, quote, spark of the life, their actual, quote, fire of existence. The wise ones of all times knew about this secret, preached it to the peoples in the form of the spiritual teaching, and encountered resistance, unintellect, and hatred. These wise ones and prophets proclaimed the spiritual realm in the human being, but how evilly were their teachings further spread and falsified, religiously and politically changed into other and purely human values. They lost their original sense, were attributed to a controllable God, and elaborated for their nearly perfect use. The sense of the teaching of creation was thus displaced, and created space for might-greedy human beings who, even in the present time, still call themselves God, Pope, Cardinal, Bishop, etc. Human beings of the earth and other worlds, who in their megalomania wanted to press themselves into the actual being of the creation, through which the earth human being became in bondage to them. They raised human gods to the standing of the creation, and imputed the almightiness to them. And in order to make the irrational teachings more worthy of belief, the gods exalted to the creation were hidden in some inaccessible places, or on other worlds, or they were kept hidden by their proponents and representatives. These hiding places were clothed in the term heaven, where the corresponding God leads his allegedly fair and eternal regiment and holds all becoming and passing in his hands. And where, therefore, has the earth human being especially looked for their God for around 2,000 years, particularly the Christian and Islamic earth human being? Self-evidently, naturally in heaven, where an imaginary God being can be most appropriately kept from the eyes of the believers, and no danger exists that a material life form will ever gain access. How could this, then, even be possible, since heaven and hell represent only fantasy products of unrealistically thinking human beings, and could not find any existence according to all creational laws and recommendations? Through human fantasy products and irrational teachings, however, the values of the creational existence were lost, and the whole spiritual teaching was changed into values of the material. Thus it could happen that the, quote, clergy of earthly religions were able to place too much value on the outer frameworks and stunted the inner, liberating values of the consciousness. A factor which was not simply achieved senselessly and without purpose, because through these machinations and irrational teachings, the earth human being became dependent in a belief-based manner and thus unfree in his or her own consciousness in the thinking, doings, and deeds. And precisely this was the purpose of all the unreal teachings, because a belief-dependent human being is afraid of an unsubmissive development of his or her consciousness, through which enslavement and exploitation are guaranteed. The, quote, clergy of earthly religions were conscious of this already very early on, and in their striving for might, they did not leave this knowledge unused. Thus, they raised the values into external structures, because they knew the thinking form of the earth human beings exactly, that namely every value of a thing rises there in all places when there is even only apparently something tangible. The construction of a tangible and palpable house of God had to, with the precision of a clockwork, evoke the attitude and the irrational belief that at least there must be something true about the matter, because how else could a house of God be built? If there were thus no God in existence, then likewise no house of God could be built. The unlogical forms of thinking of the earth human being simply do not allow any other logical conclusions. According to their forms of thinking, a house of God can only then be built if also a God plays a role in it, or is in connection with it. On the other hand, however, the human beings were intimidated by religious representatives of all times, by sermons, etc., so much that they never again dared to raise doubts. Emphatically, however, it should also be explained that a lie becomes a delusion in a relatively short time, and that the originator of the lie themselves, after a short time, is no longer able to distinguish it from the truth, through which, though notorious, is characterized in this form. As the, quote, clergy and their believers place too much value on the external structures, on the house of God, and other unreal and worthless holy places, they banish all values of the spiritual, and are not able to ignite the light of creation within themselves. This has been the case for a long time, and has remained so up to the hour, because all religions and their advocates and believers believe that they could not live without a worthy place of worship. A typical earth human irrational teaching, and the proof that the religious teachings represent human irrational teachings. Every only halfway rationally thinking human being must be clear that only material life forms need a palpable object in the form of a building or tent, etc., in order to carry out religious prayers and imagined associations with an imaginary God being in such places which are often still sanctified. Only material life forms concentrate themselves in this manner, and in buildings, etc., constructed and determined exclusively for this purpose. And because already at early times so-called gods gave commands for the construction of such objects for their worship, it should be clear to the rationally thinking earth human beings that these gods, in line with their form, were not able to think and act differently than was characteristic of them, namely, humanly. True spiritual forms do not need special and sanctified places, for they have their homes everywhere. First and foremost, they are equally alive and permanent as laws and recommendations in all spheres. And secondly, the spiritual form lives largely in the human life form. These are the places of the spirit where it is gathered without cease. If godly and unreal venerations are offered in houses of God, etc., the true spirit form thus does not concern itself with such irrational venerations and worships, because it works according to the laws and recommendations of the evolution, and thus in the sense of the relative absolute fulfillment. Explained in another manner, this means that the application of a religion, its dogmas, and Ausartungen, fundamentally always amount to a worship and veneration of any higher Wesenheiten, etc., and thereby already hold back and restrain the spiritual and consciousness-based evolution in its fundamental substances. The true spiritual teaching, however, the true spirit form, is not subject to worship and veneration, but rather works in accordance with the laws and recommendations of the evolution towards an absolutely full development, runs tantamount to it, and banishes all untruth into their confines. Observed and considered precisely, religion in its application thus means regressiveness and persistence in old and unreal paths in this relation, whereas spiritual teaching means further development in the sense of the fulfillment of absolutely full development. Thus, in this sense, if places and buildings, etc., are built for the spreading of the spiritual teaching and its resulting evolution of the spirit and of the consciousness, these no longer form places of worship and veneration, but rather places of teaching in good form. Places in which the spiritual teaching is proclaimed and the human being is taught and further educated in the form of the laid-out teachings for the evolution, are not places of worship and veneration, nor houses of God, etc., but rather they are pure places of the evolution of spiritual and consciousness-based facts, further educating and law-based, and only they have entitlement in an existence. Again, drawing on the cognitions already gained so far, it should be clearly emphasized once more. According to creational regulation, all creational laws and recommendations are anchored within earth human beings. Suppressed by irrational teachings, they slumber in the human being, who now has the task to again awaken, to ignite, and to unfold them. As this requires a great deal of perseverance and effort, the work will, however, be worthwhile, and will raise earth human beings to unexpected heights of the knowledge, the wisdom, the truth, the ability, and the love. Measured against the number of the earthly population in the present time, there are only very few human beings who have recognized the truth in the most minimal beginnings. They amount to a few drops of water in the sea. Now, however, it lies in the masses of the humankind to increase these few, and to let the individual droplets in the sea swell to a large body of water, because where a large body of water arises along with a storm tide, all rubbish is swept away. Many human beings of Earth make the claim that they live according to spiritual forms in their circle and that they have recognized the truth. Many advocate this claim in associations and coteries and believe that they are living up to the truth. Their love of truth, however, is smitten with blindness, for they live in unreal belief views, like those influenced by religion. They believe in complicated theories of spiritual ascension, karma, Jacob's ladder, and many other irrational teachings. They announce this fantasy knowledge in narrower and wider circles, and fundamentally incite a new irrational teaching, as it will reach that of the religion in its extent, if they do not themselves soon put a stop to their wrongdoing. Anchored in the real truth are the creational laws and recommendations, which are never changing. They are consistent through time and space, and withstand all untruth. But the truth does not assert itself on views and beliefs, but rather solely on the truth itself. It does not rest upon religious dogmas and unreal spiritual scientific views and assertions, and not upon any idealism and much good volition for the forming of a better future. Only human thinking and human fantasies foment and lay down statutes of the obligation for wanting to be spiritual endeavors. Wanting to be endeavors which are created from human and unlogical forms of thinking, and which will always remain only as wishes and fantasy dreams. In the spiritual, there are no statutes of earthly origin, neither of a human form, nor of any other form. The spirit knows no form of any endeavors, because for it only the truth is existent, the uncontrovertible fact, the existing. Wishes, views, and endeavors find no justification for life within it, because they have a doubting and destructive effect. The spirit acknowledges only the creational laws and recommendations, the truth, and the effective knowledge, as well as the source from which it proceeded, the creation, because only from it flows all life, the being, the existence. But whoever pays homage to the irrational belief that only their coterie, their association, their church, their community, their lodge, or their movement, etc., teaches the only acceptable views, is not only enslaved in their consciousness and evilly restricted in their consciousness-based field of vision, but they also live in an unreal haughtiness, which must inevitably lead to a fall. This is not only because, according to human forms of thinking, many acceptable views find their unlogical entitlement, but also because all these humanly acceptable views are based on complete unlogic and are foreign to the true spiritual teaching and its absolute truth. The recommendation of the hour forces every rationally able human being of your world to observe the signs of the time and to rightly interpret them. These signs state that the human being must again seek, find, and use the oneness with the creation in the form of its laws and recommendations for the good, while he or she has to overcome that which separates and destroys. The human being who is conscious, or becomes conscious, of the fact that every single life form on their part has a regulatory bound obligation, will come to the cognition with clear and objective consideration that at the present time it is the unavoidable recommendation of the hour to put to use all available powers in order to experience the future in all truth. Around the world, the human being has confined their earth with borders erected from the perspective of their very poor and limited thinking. Borders that make the life and the freedom more difficult for you, borders that are the product of unlogical and might-greedy forms of thinking. From the still, simple snobbery up to the state and national borders guarded by deadly weapons, a very long chain of murders and tortures, of religious wars and political wars, of hatred and greed for might, and of restrictions and limitations of all kinds, is to be accounted for. Every paragraph and every provision, from human forms of thinking, constrict every law of the freedom, even if the human beings still long for this freedom very much.